Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this first event of the fall semester and actually of the academic year for the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies. I'm Tatjana Lichtenstein. I'm the director of the center, and I'm also a faculty member in the history department here at UT Austin. The Schusterman Center's fall events range in terms of topics from talks about the Holocaust like the one today, film screenings also on the Holocaust this semester, as well as talks and workshops on Judaism in 20th century America, Latin American literature, connections between Judaism and early Christianity, so a really wide range of topics. And you can read about all of these events and follow along when they are on our website as well as in our newsletter, which we have put on some of the tables. Some of you have grabbed one. You're welcome to take one, where you can also learn more about what's happening at the Schusterman Center, the faculty and student research that happens here at UT Austin on Jewish topics, a new internship program in arts and social services, as well as upcoming events this academic year. Today's talk is sponsored by the Fishman Family Lecture on East European Jewish Life and Culture, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dr. David Fishman to UT. Dr. Fishman is a professor of history at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and as a scholar he wears several hats. First, he's a historian of modern Yiddish culture in the 19th and 20th centuries in Eastern Europe. And his most well-known book on that topic is The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture. For 15 years, he was the editor of the Yiddish language scholarly journal of YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research, which is an institution you'll hear, I think, more about in today's talk. Dr. Fishman's second hat is as a director of a major archival project in the former Soviet Union. And in this project, he oversees the mapping of Jewish archival materials in the region that until World War II was the home of some of the most important Jewish communities in Europe. His third hat is as a historian of the Holocaust, and in that capacity, he serves as a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. He's published extensively on the Nazi looting of Jewish libraries and archives in Eastern Europe, as well as on Jews' responses to destruction of their cultural heritage and to the destruction of their own communities. His most recent book is called the book Smugglers, the title of the talk today as well, and it explores precisely this topic of looting and destruction. It came out last year, and I've lost count of how many languages it has already been translated into. Can you give me the number? 8 different languages already for a new book. So we're really honored to welcome you to UT.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, is this working? Can you hear me? Well, I'll go ahead. I don't really need the mic to be heard, I hope. Thank you, Tatjana, and thank you, Itzik, and thank you all for coming to this talk. I'm standing here only for one reason. I need the clicker, the mouse, to show you pictures. I was mentioning to Tatjana, this is my first visit in Austin in more than 30 years, and you've only gotten bigger, right? You were enormous then, and you're even bigger now. I'm going to begin with a little autobiographical note, how I came to this topic, which is the topic of the rescue of Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis in the city Vilna in Eastern Europe. And that also is a story that goes back almost 30 years. I was a young assistant professor, and I got a call from the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in Manhattan, and they said, we just found out about this cache of Jewish material in a church, or actually a former church, in Vilnius, Lithuania. Can you travel with us to Vilnius to evaluate it? What is there? It's books, it's papers, you're a historian, you know the languages. And I went on that trip. This is in the waning years of the Soviet Union. And found an amazing kaleidoscope of material, both old books and documents and manuscripts. And ever since then, I've been interested in how did those materials end up in this former church, which I saw in 1990. And I guess really the story, I didn't think I'd write a book about that. That occurred to me much later. Today's talk is to explain to you how it happened that we found that material in a church in Lithuania in 1990. Okay, the city, Jews call it Vilna. Lithuanians, because today it's the capital of Lithuania, call it Vilnius. Before the war, it was Poland, and Poles called it Vilna. All right, this is a border region with the cities have many names, but this is a map of Poland before World War II, and you can see Vilna up in the northeastern corner of what was then Poland. The borders shifted many times in this area. For centuries, it belonged to Russia. Between the wars, it belonged to Poland. Today, it belongs to Lithuania. Jews always called this city Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Regardless of who was in charge, whether the Poles or the Russians, Jews called it Lita, Lithuania. And that name, Jerusalem, excuse me, let me try to go back if I can. I may need some technical help figuring out how to go back. What? I'm sorry. Previous, there we are. Okay. That's a powerful name, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. That's a powerful image. Not every Jewish community, even prominent Jewish community, gets called Jerusalem. And that is because it had this very special tradition of learning, Jewish learning, and of scholarship and book culture. I actually call it the city of the book. This is Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna, who really founded that tradition of devotion to study, to books, to learning. He really believes study of the holy books is the central feature of Judaism, not so much prayer, not so much other things, but study. And he got that ball rolling of Vilna as a center of book culture. So that in the 19th century, the great edition, the classical edition of the Talmud, right, the great work of Judaism after the Bible, the classical edition of the Talmud is the Vilna edition of the Talmud. And then in the 20th century, when Jews are more secular and have more modern interests, it becomes a great center of Yiddish printing, not Hebrew, not religious, but Yiddish and secular. And this is just a potpourri of Yiddish newspapers and magazines that appeared in Vilna in the 1920s and 1930s. At its peak, there were 5 Yiddish daily newspapers in Vilna. That's a lot of Yiddish daily newspapers. This city only had 60,000 Jews on the eve of the Holocaust. It wasn't the largest Jewish community in Poland. It was the 4th largest Jewish community in Poland. And nonetheless, those 60,000 were about a third of the city's population. That's a very high proportion, a third. But more important than the numbers is still the idea that you could have 5 Yiddish daily newspapers for a community of 60,000. In other words, this is a reading community. And it's a cultural center. Obviously, those newspapers were read not only locally. Not only is it a center of printing, but it's a center of libraries and of reading. This is a picture in the background of the Great Synagogue, the Shtochel, as it was called in Yiddish, that goes back to 1572. And in front of it, the Jewish Communal Library, the Strashun Library, which was actually built much later, at the end of the 19th century. And when it was built, they decided to have a community-based library, open to the public, free of charge. When they decided to do that, they built the library, very symbolically, next door to the synagogue, almost as if to say the library is a kind of second sanctuary for this community. This is the reading room of the community library. Limited number of seats. Sometimes people had to wait online to get a seat in the community library. Sometimes people stood against the walls. And as you can see in this picture, you have some, you don't see women in this picture, though there were often, I don't think there are any women, but there were both men and women, pious Jews with their heads covered, modern Jews. It really was a kind of center of where all sectors of the community met. At it, I should have said, the community library had mainly religious literature, mainly Hebrew literature. It had 5 incunabula, that is, Hebrew books printed before the year 1500. Those are very rare, very valuable. The second great collection in Vilna of Jewish material was this Yiddish Scientific Institute, YIVO. This is a modern academy for the study of the Jews, of Jewish history and culture. It uses the methods of the humanities and social sciences to study Jewish life, especially contemporary and modern Jewish life. YIVO had a great Yiddish library, but maybe even more important, it had a great archive. It had all kinds of records of communal organizations. It had personal collections of records, and it had folklore, as Itzik Gottesman could tell you, great collection of Yiddish folklore that people wrote down and sent in to YIVO. Again, the YIVO reading room and all kinds of other activities. And to round it out, I'm not going to list every library, but this Jerusalem of Lithuania had a museum, had yeshivas, had teacher seminaries, synagogues, and of course, when you got a city like that, I guess you could call it a university town, right? So you've got the private collections of all these scholars, all these researchers, teachers, etc., who often have things that are not in other libraries. Last but not least, it's not only a community of readers and of printers, but also of writers. This is the literary group, the Yiddish literary group, Young Vilna. Poets, storytellers, some plastic artists, and these 2 poets that will actually become central to the story I'm going to tell you, Abraham Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski. I'm just going to call him Shmerke, because Kaczerginski is a long and hard name. Here's their magazine, Young Vilna, right? And Vilna is an old Jewish community, so Young Vilna is almost like an oxymoron, or a 2-part name that's in tension with itself. And you can see, this is the old cobblestone streets of the old Jewish quarter of Vilna, and this is the new, the smokestack of the factory and of the modern world. The Jewish eye moves from right to left, so as the Hebrew alphabet goes, so that the old leads into the new. Okay, now I have to get to my topic proper and tell you something about the Nazi occupation of Vilna, the German occupation. The Germans came to Vilna in June 1941 as part of the campaign against the Soviet Union. The trajectory, the dynamic of what happened to the Jews there is very different than, let's say, Warsaw and the Warsaw Ghetto, which is more familiar to most of us. Because most ghettos have this gradual downward trajectory. In 1 year gets worse than the other, disease increases, hunger increases, deportations then begin, etc. The Vilna ghetto has a totally different dynamic, which is the Germans come in and there is 6 months of 6 months. I wonder why that happened, but all right. Is it okay? Can we? Yes, I want it on because I'm an experienced teacher and I know in the dark students fall asleep. Thank you. Okay, so in the Vilna ghetto, the dynamic is as follows. In the first 6 months, there is this trauma and blow of tremendous bloodletting. Of the 60,000 Jews in Vilna before the war, after 6 months, only 20,000 are left. 40,000 in 6 months are deported, are rounded up in all kinds of raids and roundups, and deported to a place on the outskirts of town known as Ponar, Ponari, Ponarii, depending on your language. And they are mowed down by machine guns or by shootings. This is the Holocaust by bullets, as it's now called. This is before there was any Auschwitz or any death camps with using gas chambers, crematoria, etc. And then in January 1942, the mass murder stops. And there won't be massive scale murdering for the next year and a half. That is from January 42 to the middle of 1943. This is what's known as the period of stability in the history of the Vilna ghetto. There are all kinds of atrocities, but they are by no means of the scale of what was seen between July and December of 41. In this period of stability, the Jews are working as slave laborers for the Germans. It's a very grim and difficult life because congestion in the Vilna ghetto is like in any other ghetto. You've got 8 people in a room, 10 people in a room. People are sleeping on tables, bundles all over the floor. Of course, food rations are meager. So I'm not saying life is good, but it is no longer the panic and hysteria of the first 6 months. The story I'm going to tell you really mainly takes place in this period of stability, the 1.5 years of stability. Because food rations are meager, and because the main thing is to get food. Now, most of these Jewish slave laborers work outside the ghetto in factories and shops of different kinds, or at the train station, etc. So what they do is at the end of the workday, they're going to try to hide food under their clothing and smuggle it past the guards at the gate, the entrance point to the Vilna ghetto. That gate is manned by actually 3 types of guards. There are Jewish guards, because there's ghetto police, a topic we could discuss separately. There are Lithuanian guards, the local municipal police. But what is most serious is if there are German guards. And sometimes very high-ranking German officials will decide just to spend a few hours at the gate inspecting Jewish slave laborers as they return to the ghetto. In those cases, everyone gets tense, and in those cases, people will be sent to their deaths for hiding a little bit of food under their clothing. In the Vilna ghetto, and before, there was a Jewish singer. She was an opera singer, also a folk song singer, classical singer, Lyuba Levitskaya. She hid a bag of peas under her body, and when it was discovered, she was sent to her death at Ponar. Okay, now to the body of the topic itself. I have to introduce you to the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, as we'll call it. The ERR was Nazi Germany's primary agency for looting cultural treasures. They're active all across Europe. They were very active in Paris, where they loot a lot of art, and also the National Library. They're active in Holland. The basic idea the Germans had was that the master race is entitled to have the master library, the master museum. It is, as the master race, should have all the cultural treasures in the world. And they're active also on the Eastern Front. What is less known is that the ERR had a special department for looting, collecting, as they would call it, Judaica. That is, books in Hebrew and in Yiddish, or other books related to Jewish religion, history, culture, etc. And again, they're doing that everywhere, from the Rabbinical Seminary in Amsterdam to the Jewish community of Salonika. They've got this department which is headed by this man, Dr. Johannes Paul. Paul is fluent in Hebrew and Yiddish. He spent 2 years in Jerusalem. He had an advanced clerical training. He's a priest, he's a Catholic priest, and he went for advanced pontifical studies, first in Rome, then in Jerusalem. He knows Hebrew well, he knows Yiddish well, and he is the mastermind of the looting of Judaica all across Europe. Paul knew that Vilna is an important center of Jewish books and of materials. He came to Vilna, actually, for the first time, 2 weeks after the Germans had invaded. So they come in on June 24th. He's there July 7th. Because Vilna is a priority on his agenda. Nonetheless, he's stunned. He never expected as many books and as many treasures as he finds in this city. And he doesn't know what to do. Because he doesn't have a lot of staff who know Hebrew and Yiddish, who can select. You're not going to send everything to Germany. He has to select. I should have explained one reason. Why are the Germans collecting this Judaica? Well, they're exterminating the Jews because they have a scientific discipline called Judenforschung, study of the Jews, which they believe justifies, in scholarly scientific terms, the persecution of the Jews. In other words, this science, this anti-Semitic science, will prove that the Jews are depraved, that the Jews are evil, that they are harmful to civilization, and therefore they're the enemy of the Aryan race, and therefore this science, whether it's historical, anthropological, sociological, all methods are fair and game as long as they prove the point of Nazi ideology, that is, the Jews must be persecuted and eventually eliminated. So the purpose of the looting of the Judaica is to provide the basis for serious anti-Semitic Judenforschung. Okay, getting back to my point. He doesn't need 10 copies of the same book, because there's so many libraries. He just needs 1 copy of valuable books. You're not going to send everything to Germany. You must have a sorting process. Send the valuable stuff to Germany and destroy the rest as trash. But who can do that? And he comes up with the only device he could think of. You must create a brigade of Jewish slave laborers. They're using Jews as slave labor for all kinds of purposes, also for this purpose, to sort what goes to Germany and what will be destroyed. He creates a quota, 30% to Germany, no more. And the other 70% is to be destroyed. This is just an example of a Hebrew book with a Nazi swastika at the bottom, actually from the main center for Judenforschung, the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, for the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question, right? So they get a Hebrew book and they stamp it. This institute in Frankfurt develops one of the richest Judaica libraries in the world by looting from all across Europe. But again, in some ways, Vilna is the crown, in the jewel in the crown. Okay, who are these Jewish slave laborers? There were actually 20 Jewish intellectuals forced to do this job. They're scholars, they're educators, librarians, artists, musicians. They really run the full gamut. In the book, I have mainly 5 heroes, and that's already a lot, probably too much. This is the formal head of the group, Hermann Kruk. He's a librarian and bibliographer a refugee from Warsaw. He's really from Warsaw, but he fled to Vilna in 1939. I'll just mention in passing, besides being the head of this slave labor brigade, which is called the Paper Brigade. They all get nicknamed as the Paper Brigade. Jews in the ghetto call them the Paper Brigade. Because what are they doing? They're just packing papers, pushing papers. It's said very mockingly by other ghetto inmates, even as if it's the brigade of weak-bodied intellectuals. That's what the Paper Brigade means. That's his one job, head of the slave labor brigade. The other job he has is there happens to be a library inside the Vilna ghetto. It's a library, a lending library, not a great library, but a lending library that existed on those streets where the ghetto was formed from before the war. And the Germans don't close it down. They let Jews use it. And he is director of the ghetto library. This is a poster, in Yiddish, for a public event in the Vilna ghetto to mark the lending of 100,000 books in the Vilna ghetto library. In other words, the library becomes a major lifeline for ghetto inmates. It's a way they reaffirm their humanity. It's also a way they simply escape. In other words, read a novel, read a book, don't think about the present. Read about something far away and forget your hunger, forget your problems. But it's also a way of feeling like a human being under conditions that are really trying to dehumanize you. So he's head of that ghetto library, and he's also head of this paper brigade. The others, quickly, this is a scholar, Zelig Kalmanovich, one of the scholars of YIVO from before the war. I should mention Kalmanovich was a Zionist. The previous person I showed you, Kruk, was a Bundist, that is a Jewish socialist. Kalmanovich is a Zionist. At this point, he's also a religious believer. But they get along well, these two men who are very, very different politically and ideologically. And here are our two poets, Sutskever and Kaczerginski. They're also hired, or engaged to be in this paper brigade. And I just want to mention one other figure who has a special story, Rachela Krinsky, or Rachel Krinsky, a friend. She is a high school teacher of history. She has a master's degree from Vilna University. She knows Latin. She knows medieval German, early modern Polish. She's a very highly educated woman. She has a very special personal story. Her husband was killed in one of the very first roundups sent to Ponar, literally in July 1941. She's a widow. They have an 18-month baby. When the Vilna ghetto was formed and all Jews are herded into the ghetto, they're forced to go into the ghetto, literally by foot, to march into the limited streets that are designated as the ghetto. She decides she's not taking her baby into the ghetto. She hands the baby over to her nanny, her Polish nanny, and asks the nanny to take care of the baby. The nanny moves to another part of town where she can tell people this is her daughter, and she raises that daughter during the war years, and Rachela goes to the ghetto alone, without her husband who's dead and without her daughter who's now with her nanny. And she says the only thing that kept, she says later she did survive, that all that kept her going were two things: her friends, like the poets, and poetry. She loved to read poetry. She's an avid reader. They're all avid readers. They're all book lovers. And what they're being asked to do, of course, is be complicit in the destruction of Jewish culture. To basically, for them to see a tractor or a bulldozer mow a mountain of books, all the more so Yiddish books, is for them an excruciating experience. Rachela almost didn't agree to work in this brigade because she didn't think she could take it emotionally, to see the destruction of books on that level. The work site where they work is actually the building that was once YIVO, this Yiddish Institute. Since it has one of the largest collections, the other collections were sent there for processing. The building is mountains and mountains of books and of papers, and the job is to sort. Of course, whatever is destroyed rather ruthlessly. This is a portion of a Torah scroll, right? The 5 books of Moses that are read in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Torah scrolls are made of parchment, which means it's animal skin, it's like leather, it's strong material. So the Germans would cut out pieces of the parchment and use it to repair German army books. They have to, witness this on a day-to-day basis, this kind of desecration. And of course, the pent-up emotions lead them to the conclusion that they must find another way, how to hide material. Not to send it to Germany, and not to let it be destroyed. Not looted, not destroyed. And the main way they hide material is on their bodies. That is, at the end of the workday, when a German isn't in the room, they will pick things they've prepared during the day in a little pile and wrap it around their torso, make a little diaper underneath, or if it's a small booklet, put it under your boots. And they will do that, again, 20 people for a year and a half. You do the math. If you can save many thousands of things, 20 people over a year and a half carrying it in on your bodies. This processing center in Vilna becomes more of a local endeavor, becomes a regional endeavor. In other words, Jewish books from other cities and towns are sent to Vilna for this kind of sorting. In fact, not only Jewish books. The Germans realize they've got very highly educated staff, slave laborers, cost nothing, who can process all kinds of books. So they start sending Polish books and Russian books, especially Soviet books. The Nazis, after all, are obsessed with 2 enemies, the Jews and the Bolsheviks. So they want to get Bolshevik literature. And these Jewish slave laborers process that Polish and Russian material as well, and they hide also Polish and Russian materials, letters by Gorky, letters by Tolstoy, etc. All right, but the moment of truth is at the ghetto gate. And here I can't go through all the incidents that happen at the ghetto gate. I think I'll tell you 2. Rachela Krinsky, the history teacher, she once hid in her pocket a cup for wine, for the blessing over wine that Jews make on the Sabbath, which is called Kiddush. It's a silver cup, goblet. There was a German at the gate. He discovered this in her pocket, and everyone is sure Rachela is going to be sent to her death. She turns around to the German and said, "Oh no, I brought this for you. It's a present. And by the way, I also happen to have a very nice pair of gloves. You can give them to your wife." And the German probably basically accepted the bribe. I don't know, he bought the line, but he accepted the bribe and let her through. She was just very, very lucky. One other story, the poet Schmerke. He comes, his body loaded up with material, and there's a long line at the ghetto gate. Why is there such a long line? Because a very high-ranking German is at the gate, and he is checking everybody meticulously, and so there's a big backup of the line. As word spreads on the line that Murer is at the gate, everybody drops on the street, on the ground, their potatoes, their bread, whatever food items they had. They don't want to get caught because you can hear the shouts and screams of people who have been caught as they're getting whipped and beaten. But Shmerke, the poet, doesn't drop the stuff. Everyone's saying, come on, drop it, drop it. He doesn't drop it. He's nervous. He's ready for whatever's going to happen. He doesn't drop it because, by the way, books, there's only one work site that had books. They're going to know it's somebody from that work brigade. It's not like potatoes, which are unidentifiable. Books are identifiable. And maybe the whole group will be punished for this violation. So he goes to the gate, and as he's about to get there, the German gets tired and leaves. And the people at the front of the line push their way into the ghetto. Everyone is so excited, bewildered that Muir has left, and he gets into the ghetto. And some people around him all say, some people have all the luck. And I left my potatoes on the ground. In the ghetto, I should explain, they're smuggling this material from the work site into the ghetto. Why? Because in the ghetto, it's accessible to them. They can check on it. They feel it's safe. It's among fellow Jews. So they're smuggling it from outside the ghetto into the ghetto, and they often hide it in bunkers. This is a bunker 60 feet beneath the ground. It was a ghetto inmate who was a construction engineer who built it. You enter from a manhole. You go down the sewage system. It's below the sewage system. It's got ventilation. And this actually bunker was used for two purposes: to hide the books, but originally it was built to hide arms, because there is an armed resistance in the Vilna Ghetto, planning to have a great uprising, Vilna Ghetto uprising. So you've got crates of books and crates of arms, literally right next to each other. Only two expressions of resistance. Now, I'm not going to read this poem with you, but of course the poets write poems about this experience. What does it feel like to have your body covered with these papers and then to bury it under the ground? And Schusterman writes this poem, one of the poets, Grains of Wheat, which has this amazing metaphor, right? Egypt, a pharaoh ordered that when he is buried in his pyramid, that next to him should be placed in his tomb grains of wheat. And then 9,000 years passed, and when the tomb is opened, someone takes those grains of wheat, plants them, and you get these stalks that blossom from those grains of wheat 9,000 years. And that's what he says in the poem. I'm not burying the material, I'm planting the material. I believe that someday it will blossom, it will be found, and it will serve, the words will belong to the people in its eternal walk. Another way they rescue material is with non-Jewish friends. This work site had one weakness. The Germans left it unguarded during the lunch hour. That is, the Germans left for lunch, and they didn't leave anybody really to watch what's going on during the lunch hour. And that meant that non-Jewish friends could come, meet with the slave laborers, give them food, give them encouragement, news, and could take books and papers home and hide them in their places. This is Anna Shemaitia. She was a librarian, an ethnic Lithuanian, not a Pole, but a Lithuanian, who was a librarian at the Vilna University Library. She took a lot of material from the Yiva work site, but she did even more than that. She entered the Vilna Ghetto several times, a non-Jew who entered the Vilna Ghetto. How did she get into the Vilna Ghetto? She didn't even sneak in. What she did is she went to the guards and said, I'm a librarian at the university library. These ghetto inmates have overdue library books. And I have to go into the ghetto to collect books that belong to us from the library. They let her in. And material that had been smuggled into the ghetto was then given to her, which she took out. These were the overdue library books. On one occasion, she didn't take out books, she took out a girl, a 9-year-old girl, who survived. And, sorry if I get emotional. Ona Shemaita was recognized as a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem very early in the 1960s. She actually, Ona Shemaita herself survived and lived in Israel in the 1950s. Okay, to move the story forward, our poets survive. They belonged to the armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto, and they were lucky enough to leave the ghetto just a few weeks before the Germans dissolved the ghetto. Dissolve the ghetto is a polite way of saying everyone is sent either to labor camps or to death camps. But they left the ghetto before it was dissolved. Most such people who left through the sewage system. You enter a manhole and you literally crawl through the pipes, and they get out to the forests where they fight with partisans, and they will survive. The other heads of this brigade will perish. The librarian, the scholar, they'll end up in camps in Estonia where the inmates will be killed. Rachela Krinsky survives, but really goes through hell in this camp, Stutthof. Stutthof is not famous like Auschwitz or Treblinka, but it actually was an overflow camp for Auschwitz. In 1944, it becomes a death camp with its own crematorium because there are so many Hungarian Jews being sent to Auschwitz in 1944. Auschwitz is working at full capacity. So others will be sent to Stutthof. She miraculously survives, though she's a very broken woman. She has letters that she writes right after her liberation where she says, there's really no justice in my living. I don't know what, I see other people here are getting married, having, falling in love. I don't know how they do it. I don't know what love is. She's deeply depressed. The only thing she wants is to reunite with her daughter, who's back in Vilna with her nanny. And she writes in a letter, again to the poets who are her good friends, maybe my daughter will help me. And she herself is very aware of the irony. Not that I can do anything for my daughter in my current state, and the nanny has been, from what I hear, a great mother to my daughter, so I can't do anything for my daughter, but maybe my daughter will help me find some kind of meaning in my life. She will work on that, and that will eventually happen. I'll come back to that in a minute. The poets come back to Vilna. The Red Army liberates Vilna in July 1944. They come, of course, this is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon in ruins. They find a city in ruins. This is the YIVO building in ruins. And they come back to retrieve the treasures. They're not looking for family. They know their family has been killed. They're not looking for property. They're coming, to an apartment or something. They're coming back to retrieve the treasures from these different bunkers. And it becomes a whole operation of lots of survivors who participate in this, including Abba Kovner, who had been the leader of the armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto. And they accumulate a lot of material, and they create, with all that rescued material, retrieved material, a Jewish museum in Vilnius, right? In Russian, Yiddish, and Lithuanian Jewish museum. But this Jewish museum, this is in a big building, actually the building that had been the ghetto library in the ghetto. This had also been the ghetto sports field. So. But they didn't realize immediately the problem they faced. Vilna is liberated from the Nazis. It is now part of the Soviet Union. And very quickly, the Soviet bureaucratic apparatus tries to strangle this young institution. Sometimes it's small little routine things like no salaries, no glass for the windows. But then things get more serious. The man responsible is Mikhail Suslov, who was then the head of the Lithuanian Bureau of the Communist Party of the USSR. Suslov is dead set against any Jewish cultural institutions in Lithuania. He wants to close this institution down. So serious things like happened. They had a lot of material in the courtyard. There wasn't enough space in the building to fill it. So there was material in the courtyard. One night, the trash administration comes, the sanitation department, and takes all of that material from the courtyard and sends it away as trash. And that's when the poets say, Suslov is no better than Johannes Paul. As far as this material, it's as much in danger under the Soviets as it was under the Nazis. So there must be a new solution, which is to get it out of the Soviet Union. Because otherwise it's either going to be destroyed or just locked away, locked up. They are fortunate. There is at this time what's known as, they are all, these poets and the others, former Polish citizens, which gives them the right to return to their homeland, to emigrate, to repatriate is what it's called, to Poland. So they start giving little packages to all their friends who are leaving the USSR for Poland to hide in false bottoms in their suitcases, take it to Poland and deliver it to this and this address in Łódź in Poland. And then they themselves will leave, both poets, and smuggle material across the border. I'm sorry, this is the material that was taken to the trash administration. So this is one of the suitcases used for smuggling material out of the Soviet Union. The poets end up in Poland. Again, our two poets are the ones here on the left. And there they face, Poland is not yet fully communist yet, in 1945. They face a choice where to send the material. YIVO, or in New York, because there's a reconstituted YIVO Institute in New York, or Palestine, soon to be Israel. They will end up sending most of it to New York. But Sutzkever will emigrate to Palestine and will take some of it there and will eventually give it to the National Library of Israel. What happened to Rachel Krinsky? Rachel Krinsky goes to Poland and writes to her Polish nanny and says, "You are also a Polish citizen. Please leave Vilna, leave the Soviet Union, and come to Poland and bring my daughter to me." And she re-meets her daughter basically after not seeing this daughter for almost 4 years, right? The daughter was 18 months old, and now she's 5.5. And she doesn't remember this woman. She calls the nanny mommy, and she calls her mother ma'am. And the three live together in a very difficult triangle, which takes months for her to regain her daughter's trust and to, until at one point in a letter she says, "She is my daughter again." Moving back, the Jewish Museum in Vilnius is closed down. A few years later, everything is confiscated. All its remaining collections are confiscated, and they will be put in this former church, St. George's Church in Vilnius. They will sit there, the materials in St. George's Church, for, 45 years. They're lucky they're not destroyed. The director was a hero to hide the material in St. George's Church. And that's the material that I saw in 1990. It had been in St. George's Church since the late 1940s. Okay, what did they rescue? A quick last thing. You know, what kind? I've been talking cultural treasures, documents, books. I just want to give you a potpourri of the kind of things they rescued. This is a handwritten diary by Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, from the 1880s, which was in the Vilna Yivo and today is in the New York Yivo. This is the record book of the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon had a private synagogue by invitation only. You couldn't just show up. It's closed for him and his students. But they kept a minute book of all their meetings of the administration of the synagogue. That synagogue existed for 150 years. The minute book, or the Pinkas of that synagogue. Rare little Yiddish books. I like this one especially, Prayers for Childbirth, right, from the mid-19th century. If you're having difficulty giving birth in the 19th century, there's no anesthesia, there's no epidural, all you can do is pray. And these are prayers for a woman in childbirth to say as she's giving birth. Yes, synagogue art of all kinds. And as you're seeing, some of this material is in New York, some of it's in Lithuania, some of it you'll see is in Israel. Right, letters by the great Yiddish author Sholem Aleichem, the author of Tevye the Dairyman, which became the basis for Fiddler on the Roof. Sholem Aleichem was this very prolific letter writer. Over 50 letters by him were rescued by the paper brigade. Yes, a bust of Leo Tolstoy by a Vilna-born Jewish sculptor, Ilya Ginsburg. And then you have material which is from, not historical, but from the ghetto itself, from their own times, because they realize they're going through great historical event. This is a program of the symphony orchestra of the Vilna ghetto. There was a symphony orchestra in the Vilna ghetto in the period of stability, and that's the concert program. This is a call to arms by the resistance of the Vilna ghetto. Okay, I've given you a sense of the variety of materials they rescued. To wrap it up, what happened with the heroes? Schusterman, as I mentioned, settled in, it was not quite yet Israel, it was still British Mandatorial Palestine in 1947. He became actually the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century, and the editor of the premier Yiddish journal, lived a long life. Many literary awards, including Pras Yisrael, the Israel Prize, which is Israel's highest honor. Went on to be very much the bridge between Vilna and Israel, between Yiddish culture and the Hebrew-speaking Israel. Kaczerginski, he had once been a communist, he's no longer a communist. He ended up settling in Argentina, headed a Jewish cultural organization in Buenos Aires. When he took that job, the head of this Congress for Jewish Culture in Buenos Aires, he said, I promise you my full devotion to this job, and I know what it means to be devoted to culture. Me and my colleagues in the Vilna ghetto knew what it means to be devoted to culture. Tragically, he died in an airplane crash in 1954. So he survived Hitler and the Nazis. He got out of the Soviet Union and survived Stalin and Stalinism, only to die in a fluke airplane crash. Rachel Krinsky came to America. She lived in New Jersey. She got married, and something she never thought she'd do. And this is a picture of Rachel now in her older years with her husband, Avram Melezin, and her daughter, Sarah, that same daughter, Sarah, and her granddaughter, who now lives in Berkeley, California. So it's an amazing story of heroism, of resistance, and of a different kind, and of devotion to culture and to the book, and to be willing to say that culture and the book is even bigger than our own life. And if I'm going to die, I'd rather die smuggling a book than smuggling a potato. And it's a story worth remembering when we talk in abstract terms about moral resistance, spiritual resistance. I think it's all concretized by this story of the Paper Brigade. Thank you. I'd be happy to respond to your comments, questions.
What happened to the contents in church that you saw in 1990?
The material that was in the church in 1990 now belongs to the either the Lithuanian National Library, where there is a Judaica department in independent Lithuania, or in the National Archives. They had to split it up. The documents went to the archives, and the books are in the National Library. There's a big project for YIVO in New York to digitize that material, because you realize what ended up, these are really divided collections. In other words, you can have a manuscript and page 1 is in New York and page 2 is in Vilnius, Lithuania. This has to be integrated, right? So the material is held under good conditions. Or I'll leave it at that.
Can you talk a little bit about the condition of Jewish life in Vilnius today?
Okay, but only briefly. I think now even the Jewish, there's a Jewish community, about 3,000 Jews in Vilnius. There's a synagogue, there is a school, there is a community center. It's a rather active community for its very modest numbers. I could leave it at that, but I say more broadly in Lithuania, Jews are like Native Americans here. We all know that much of the land we live on once belonged to these Native Americans, and I know Manhattan belonged to a tribe. Do I feel guilty about it? Not really. How often do I think about it? Almost never. So I would say the events of what happened to the Jews of Vilna, for most Lithuanians, it's ancient history. It's almost inconceivable to them that that city once was a third Jewish. Many Lithuanians think that's a lie. Must be a myth. It can't be. They can't even imagine it. So that's sad. For me, I know too much. In other words, when I go to Vilnius, I'm always sad, because I know every street and I know what happened there in many different years, and it's very painful. But for Lithuanians, this Jewish chapter is something more mythological, vague, and a long time ago. Yes. Okay, again, I'll try to keep it brief, but of course, like any society, Jews were very divided, mainly between three sectors: Zionists, socialists of different stripes, and the religious Orthodox, and all kinds of smaller groups in between. It is true that most of the writers in this group, Jung Vilna, were on the left, and even Smerka was a communist, but not all of them. The other poet, Sutskever, was utterly apolitical. Said the only ideology I believe in is poetry. Actually, it more works the opposite way. Not earlier, but later. The later it gets, the more you get the Jewish socialists being pro-Soviet. Because remember, by the second half of the 1930s, there are really only two choices. There's Nazi Germany, which is growing in power and its belligerence, and Poland, which is increasingly anti-Semitic in an overt way. And then there's the Soviet Union, which you don't see, but it looks, or it can, to some, look like this paradise of equality. And the only country in Europe which is vigorously opposed to anti-Semitism in the 1930s, and to Nazi Germany in the 1930s, is the Soviet Union. So actually, pro-Soviet voices grow in the second half of the 1930s among Jews in Vilna. Nonetheless, the canard that, the Jews brought Bolshevism to Vilna is utterly baseless. That's mistaking a part for the whole, right? Okay. Oh, okay. Go ahead. Well, first of all, thank you for asking the question. Because the story is a fantastic story. What only academics can appreciate is the kind of research that was necessary to piece this together. The reason this story, no one wrote a book before me. It's an interesting topic. It's a great topic. Why didn't somebody write about it 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? What is it? One of the reasons is because it's very hard to piece together. So I used the memoirs by those who survived. Rachel Akrinsky wrote letters to her granddaughter in her old age and revealed a lot of personal and even intimate things in those letters to her granddaughter, which the family shared with me. Those who perished wrote diaries in the ghetto, which were buried and hidden. And so they perished, but their diaries survived. So then the Germans, the ERR, they're a bureaucratic agency. I have all of Dr. Paul's memos and letters and reports, and I can look at the whole story from the Germans' perspective. This Jewish museum, I've got Soviet records. In other words, it's an official institution until it's closed down. So you have records of the museum. So I could piece it together and then once the war is over, they can write letters to each other, and I can follow their letters. And I probably missed a lot. But those are the basic sources. Right, so if you ask me what I'm proud of the kind of work that you have to read the footnotes, something most readers won't do, to understand what I had to do to pull this together. Right.
Any question about the photographs that you showed us from inside the workspaces of the paper brigade? So were the photographs taken by Germans?
Yes.
Is there a bigger sort of collection of those at the ER? And was there clandestine Jewish photographers in the movie?
Yes and yes. In other words, there's an album of the ERR, really basically boasting about its work. And it's got photos of, the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question, and it's got photos of exhibits, and it's also got photos of their work in Vilna. So they were proud of this work and wanted to promote it, so that's their photograph. Yes, but the photo of the poets and of Rachela taken in the ghetto, that is by somebody who had a camera in the ghetto, which is a very rare thing, yes, and is prohibited. So there isn't a lot of underground photography, but we do have photography from the Vilna ghetto. Yeah.
So the path of a book, hypothetically, might be from the slave labor processing point and then snuck into the ghetto, and then hidden in a wall or floor.
Right.
And then somehow, after the war, survivors come back, search those spaces, and then it would go to Evo, and then to the church.
No, then it would go, this is great, you're great at reconstructing it. It would then go to this Jewish museum, which they created in Vilna, right?
Right.
Then when the founders lose faith in the security of the material in the Jewish museum, whatever they can't remove everything, but they'll remove some of it from the museum, send it on to Poland, which will therefore means eventually New York and Israel. But whatever they could not remove from the museum will be seized by the Soviets when they close down the museum. And then that stuff, the stuff that remained in Vilnius that they couldn't take out, will stay in the church for 45 years.
And no one ever found the trash heaps or the process of the Soviets or the Germans. And there were no scraps left.
Oh, there was material the Germans were about to send away to be destroyed, but then they had to retreat. So as soon as the city was liberated, that's found.
Right.
But since you asked, there's one other route. I'm always waiting to see if somebody will ask this question, because it's the part of the story I don't mention in the talk. The question is, well, what happened to the 30% that was sent to Germany? 30% of what was processed was sent to Germany. Well, what happened with that? The irony is, that was the easiest and happiest story of all, because Frankfurt, where all this material ended up, was in the American zone of occupied Germany. And the American authorities, after a lot of deliberation, eventually recognized the YIVO Institute in New York as the owner of this property from the YIVO Institute in Vilna. And they ended up sending that material from Frankfurt, literally by American military shipment, to New York. In other words, that was the easiest story, right? What was sent to Germany was discovered, and after a lot of bureaucratic haggling, the Americans decided to send it to New York. They did consider sending it back to Vilnius, but the Cold War prevented that from happening. They weren't going to recognize Lithuania as part of the Soviet Union. They weren't going to so they weren't going to send anything back to Soviet-occupied Lithuania. So, given the alternative, they didn't send it back to where it came from, which was what the law said. International law at that time said, send confiscated material back to the country of origin. To the country of origin. And the American military made an exception and said, we're not sending it back to the country of origin. There were many considerations. By the way, this is Jewish material. 95% of the Jews of Lithuania were murdered. It's the highest murder rate in all of Europe. 96% of the Jews of Lithuania were murdered. What is the point, this is what Jewish organizations argued, of sending this material back to a place which is an empty hole? There are no Jews left, practically. 96% murdered. And it's the Soviet Union. We're not recognizing this as part of the Soviet Union. And so they almost, without a choice, said, you know what? YIVO is the owner, and they sent it to YIVO in New York. Of course, that material became accessible to the public in 1947. The material that the Soviets held on to only became accessible once the Soviet Union collapsed.
And Frankfurt was where the archives, where the Nazis collected. It could have been a city in East Germany.
Right, it's literally a coincidence that it was Frankfurt. If it had been Berlin or any number of other cities, if it had been Leipzig, then the Americans could have had nothing they could do. But it was Frankfurt, right?
Is there any system like triage among the people who are trying to do this work?
That's a great question. Yes, but it's rather complicated. You want to say, if it's books, printed books, you want to save one copy. You don't have to save 10 copies. That's the easy. And you know, people are sorting all the time. They said, I already saved that one. Or somebody already saved that. So that's a simple kind of triage. Part of the triage is purely based on size. You understand that you cannot carry a whole archival collection on your body. You cannot carry a folio volume of a Talmud under your clothing. So shorter and smaller is simply technically a lot easier to smuggle into the ghetto on your body, though there are other ways that non-Jewish friends can do some of the other stuff. These are snap decisions. You've got to work fast when there's no German in the room. So there's not a lot of time to think. The last thing I'll say is the poets obviously had a preference for literary material. So that's why you get the letters by Sholem Aleichem and letters by Gorky and Tolstoy, and even manuscripts. If it's not a novel, if it's a short story or a poem, it's easy to save. However, I do want to stress one thing. There's no evidence of any kind of ideological biases. Schmerke, the poet, who was a communist before the war, during the war, and for a little while after the war, you know, he's risking his life for religious literature. I've seen no evidence that the Zionist wanted to rescue just the Zionist material, and when he encountered something socialist, said, forget about it. So that there are no, this is something bigger than that. No one is having these kind of petty political or ideological distinctions when they choose what to rescue. I understood the second question more easily than the first, so let me start with the second. Yes, we do know some cases where Schmerke was beaten badly. But I only know it secondhand. He doesn't write about it. It's like, I don't know if this is a fair comparison. There are certain things people don't want to write about in their memoirs when they're humiliated and abused. And so he himself never wrote about the cases when he was beaten. But I know from other people's writing that he was caught and beaten badly. Okay, sure. Well, everyone decided. I'm sure they had conversations. But, these are people working in different rooms. It's a big building. It's got 20 rooms. And you got at most 2 people in a room. And you've got Germans walking around the building. So it's not like you can have a group decision in that kind of situation. It's 1 or 2 people making a snap decision. As far as priorities, what categories of material, I sort of went through that in the previous question. Right. The good news was Paul, he didn't want to have armed guards. And there's a lot of ambivalence here. Paul didn't want to have soldiers there because he wanted there to be what he called a civilized work environment. Now, this is full of paradoxes. He knows that he's serving the cause of exterminating the Jews for the sake of science. On the other hand, he wants a civilized work environment. Civilized work environment means no armed military guards. It means nobody there during the lunch hour. Okay. Maybe this should be the last one. Okay.
Would there be other cities in Eastern Europe that had
Similar
kind
operations.
of centers of learning that would have stories that were similar to this or different?
Yeah, that's something I decided at a certain early point not to pursue in depth in the book, because I really wanted to write a general interest book, and I didn't want to start getting into comparative. I wanted to have the narrative. But obviously we do know about ERR operations and Judaica operations in other places, but nowhere was it as long-standing and with as large a group as in Vilna. So I can talk about Amsterdam and Paris and Warsaw, and let alone Kaunas, nearby in Lithuania, and in Kiev and in Minsk. I mean, there are operations and we can reconstruct them. But the groups there of Jewish laborers were much smaller, and we could not, I didn't see the possibility to develop as compelling a story anywhere else. In part because it's small groups, and if they all get killed, and they didn't write diaries, it's hard to reconstruct the story. So I do think this is unusual, or among the many different Judaica sites that Paul supervised. And he kept coming back to Vilna. Wherever he was going on the further east, he'd always come back to Vilna. He himself realized this is a really important place. So he wasn't there all the time, but he's always supervising it. So I don't think it's, so I do think this is the best